Welcome to Egypt Revealed. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. What if the most disturbing, most hidden, and most deliberately ignored facts about ancient Egypt were never in the documentary you watched, never in the museum exhibit you visited, and never in the classroom lesson that told you Egypt was all about pharaohs, pyramids, and gold? The reality was built on something far stranger, far darker, and far more human than any of that. Archaeologists found it. Papyri confirmed it. And for a long time, academics simply chose not to talk about it in public. Here are 20 banned ancient Egypt facts so bizarre, you'll think they're fake. And this was not considered scandalous. It was considered sacred. The pharaoh performed a ritual act of public masturbation directly into the Nile River at specific points in the religious calendar. The act was tied to the myth of Atum, the creator god who was believed to have masturbated the universe itself into existence. By reenacting this moment, the pharaoh was not performing something obscene. He was performing something cosmological. The ritual was documented in temple inscriptions at Luxor and Abydos. It was officiated by priests, witnessed by selected members of the court, and timed to coincide with the annual flooding of the Nile that fertilized Egyptian agriculture. The connection was explicit and intentional. The pharaoh's body was the body of the god. What the god had done at the beginning of time, the pharaoh repeated at the beginning of each flood season. When European Egyptologists first translated the relevant inscriptions in the 19th century, several chose to leave the passages in untranslated Latin in their published works, a standard academic practice of the era for content considered too indecent for general readers. The ritual existed in plain sight on temple walls for 3,000 years. The decision to obscure it came from Victorian England, not from ancient Egypt. The Egyptians themselves saw nothing shameful in it. Shame, in this context, was entirely imported, and they kept detailed written records of exactly how to use it. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE and one of the oldest and most complete medical documents in human history, contains prescriptions that include fly excrement, crocodile dung, and human feces as active ingredients in treatments for infections, skin conditions, and intestinal complaints. This was not folk medicine practiced in secret. This was the official medical canon of one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The logic was not entirely irrational by the standards of its time. Egyptian physicians understood that certain substances produced observable effects in the body. The use of excrement was connected to a belief in sympathetic medicine, the idea that substances associated with expulsion could drive illness out of the body in the same direction. The reasoning was wrong by modern standards. The documentation of the reasoning was meticulous by any standard. The Ebers Papyrus was purchased in Luxor in 1873 by German Egyptologist Georg Ebers and translated over subsequent decades. When the excrement-based prescriptions became known to Western audiences, they were frequently cited as evidence of Egyptian primitivism by commentators who conveniently ignored that the same papyrus contains accurate descriptions of cardiovascular circulation, surgical sutures, and the management of diabetes that would not be matched in European medicine for another 2,000 years. The excrement was one paragraph. The surgical knowledge was the rest of the document. The excrement was the part that got quoted, not as a bonus, as the primary unit of compensation. The laborers who constructed the pyramids at Giza received a daily ration of approximately 4 to 5 liters of beer per person. This was not a supplemental benefit. It was salary. Archaeological excavations of the workers' village at Giza, conducted by Zahi Hawass beginning in the 1990s, uncovered industrial-scale brewery operations capable of producing thousands of liters daily, positioned directly adjacent to the construction site. Egyptian beer of the period was not what modern drinkers would recognize. It was thick, nutritionally dense, low in alcohol relative to modern standards, and packed with calories, carbohydrates, and fermented grains that provided genuine sustenance to people performing some of the heaviest physical labor in the ancient world. It was closer to liquid bread than to a recreational beverage. The brewery evidence permanently dismantled the older narrative that the pyramids were built by slaves driven by the whip. The workers were paid employees with documented rations, medical care evidenced by healed bones found in the cemetery, and a level of organization that required sophisticated administrative infrastructure. They were compensated in the currency that mattered most in an economy that had not yet developed coinage. Beer was money. Money built the pyramids. The pyramids have been in every documentary. The beer salary almost never is. Written down 3,000 years before the modern pregnancy test was invented. The Berlin Papyrus, dating to approximately 1350 BCE, describes a diagnostic procedure in which a woman who suspected she was pregnant urinated onto separate bags of wheat and barley seeds over several consecutive days. If neither sprouted, she was not pregnant. If the barley sprouted first, she would bear a son. If the wheat sprouted first, a daughter. In 1963, a team of researchers at a Johns Hopkins laboratory decided to test the actual diagnostic accuracy of this procedure. They found that the urine of pregnant women caused the seeds to sprout at a rate of approximately 70% of the time, while the urine of non-pregnant women and men did not produce germination. The sex prediction component was not reliable. The positive or negative pregnancy detection was. The working mechanism, not understood by the ancient Egyptians themselves, is that elevated estrogen levels in the urine of pregnant women do in fact stimulate seed germination. The Egyptians did not know why it worked. They knew that it worked. They wrote it down. They used it for centuries. The procedure was dismissed by European scholars for generations as ritual superstition. The Johns Hopkins study confirming its partial validity was published in a scientific journal in 1963 and received almost no coverage outside academic circles. A 3,000-year-old medical test that was right about pregnancy detection did not make the front page, and then left to marinate for months before burial. The mummification process is well known in its broad outlines. What is less discussed is the role of honey specifically in the preservation of royal bodies. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described a process in which the bodies of particularly important individuals were submerged in honey for extended periods as part of the preservation sequence. The practice was called mummification, and it was not limited to Egypt, but Egypt practiced it with characteristic thoroughness. Honey is a natural antibacterial substance with an extremely low moisture content that inhibits microbial growth. The ancient Egyptians did not understand the chemistry involved. They understood the result. A body submerged in honey resisted decomposition in a way that was observably different from bodies treated by other means. The empirical observation preceded the scientific explanation by approximately 2.5 millennia. In at least 2 documented cases from texts of the period, the honey from vessels that had been used for this purpose was later sold in Egyptian markets and consumed by buyers who were unaware of what the honey had previously contained. Whether this was accidental or deliberate is a question the historical record cannot answer with certainty. The archaeological confirmation of honey's use in high-status mummification came from residue analysis conducted on canopic jars and burial vessels from multiple sites across the Nile Valley. The analysis was published in specialist journals. It did not make it into the visitor brochures, and they were surprisingly effective at it. The Kahun Papyrus, dating to approximately 1850 BCE, contains the earliest known written prescriptions for contraception in human history. The recommended methods included a pessary made from crocodile dung mixed with a fermented substance inserted into the vaginal canal prior to intercourse, and a separate preparation made from honey and natron applied in the same manner. Modern analysis of these preparations has produced uncomfortable conclusions for those who prefer to imagine ancient peoples as medically naive. Crocodile dung has an alkaline pH. The acidity of the vaginal environment plays a significant role in sperm motility. An alkaline substance introduced before intercourse would, in principle, reduce the effectiveness of sperm. The mechanism the ancient Egyptians identified empirically was not entirely wrong. The honey preparation had similar properties. Honey's antibacterial effects and its physical viscosity would have created a barrier with partial effectiveness that modern gynecological researchers have taken seriously enough to publish on. The existence of contraceptive knowledge in ancient Egypt is rarely mentioned in popular treatments of the civilization because it complicates several narratives simultaneously. It suggests a degree of female agency in reproductive decisions that is difficult to reconcile with simplified portrayals of ancient gender roles. It also suggests that women 3,000 years ago were solving problems that Western medicine did not formally acknowledge women were trying to solve until the 20th century. The papyrus is in a museum in Berlin. It has been there since 1889. The image of Egypt and cats is warm, familiar, and almost universally misunderstood. Cats were indeed sacred animals in ancient Egypt, associated with the goddess Bastet and treated with genuine reverence in domestic contexts. What the popular image omits is the industrial-scale practice of breeding cats specifically to be killed, mummified, and sold as religious offerings to pilgrims visiting temples. Excavations at Beni Hassan in the late 19th century uncovered a single cat cemetery containing an estimated 80,000 mummified cats. The site was so large and the mummies so numerous that a substantial quantity of them were shipped to England and ground into agricultural fertilizer before scholars recognized their archaeological significance. Approximately 19 tons of cat mummies were processed this way in a single transaction in 1890. X-ray analysis of surviving cat mummies conducted in modern laboratories has revealed that the vast majority of them died from deliberate neck breaking at a very young age, typically between 1 and 4 months. The cats were not animals that had lived full sacred lives and been mummified after natural death. They were farmed, killed young, wrapped efficiently, and sold at temple gates as mass-produced devotional objects. The gap between the theological reverence for cats as sacred beings and the industrial slaughter of cats as commercial product is not a contradiction. The ancient Egyptians appeared to find troubling. The temple economy required offerings. The cat industry provided them. The two realities coexisted without apparent irony for centuries, and it was found not in a medical record, but in a mummy. In 2009, a CT scanning project led by cardiologist Gregory Thomas at the University of California examined the mummified remains of multiple ancient Egyptian individuals of high social status. The results, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2011, confirmed the presence of calcified arterial plaque, atherosclerosis, in a significant proportion of the mummies examined, including royal and priestly individuals from as far back as 1550 BCE. The most significant individual case was that of Lady Rai, a nursemaid to Queen Ahmose Nefertari, who died approximately 3,500 years ago and whose mummy showed clear CT evidence of advanced cardiovascular disease. She was estimated to have been between 30 and 40 years old at the time of death. The finding was significant because it disrupted a persistent assumption that heart disease is a product of modern diet, sedentary lifestyle, and industrial food processing. The ancient Egyptians of high status ate diets rich in domesticated meats, fowl, and foods preserved in salt. The biological mechanisms of cardiovascular disease were operating in human bodies during the reign of pharaohs, in bodies that had never encountered a processed food, a car, or an office chair. The study was published. It was discussed briefly in the press. Then the assumption quietly reasserted itself in popular health journalism. The mummies remained in their cases. in a civilization that is routinely described as ancient and primitive. Egyptian women of the Pharaonic period possessed a legal standing that women in classical Greece and Rome did not. A free Egyptian woman could enter into legal contracts independently of her husband, own and transfer property in her own name, initiate divorce proceedings, and bring legal cases before a court of law. Divorce settlements from Demotic papyri of the late period include alimony-equivalent clauses in which the husband was required to pay the wife a monthly sum following separation. This was not theoretical. Egyptian court records preserve cases in which women appear as plaintiffs and defendants, acting without male legal representation. The Wilbur Papyrus from the 12th century BCE documents female landowners of modest means managing agricultural properties in their own names. None of this meant Egyptian women were equal to men in every dimension of social life. They were not. But the legal infrastructure of female personhood that existed in Pharaonic Egypt would not be replicated in Western legal systems until the 19th and 20th centuries CE, a gap of roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years. This fact is not banned in the sense of being hidden in any archive. It is present in every serious Egyptological library. It simply does not appear in the version of ancient Egypt that gets packaged for mass consumption, because it is considerably more complicated than the version with the pyramids and the gold. The image of the Sphinx is pale desert limestone, timeless, monumental, bleached by centuries, is almost entirely wrong. Archaeological and chemical analysis conducted over several decades has confirmed that the Great Sphinx, like virtually every major Egyptian monument and sculpture, was originally covered in painted pigment. Traces of red ochre have been identified on the face of the Sphinx specifically, suggesting that the face was painted in a reddish tone. Other Egyptian statues and temple reliefs preserve traces of blue, green, yellow, and black that together indicate the original visual experience of these monuments was dramatically different from the bare stone surfaces visible today. The Egypt of the pharaohs was not a civilization of pale stone and quiet grandeur. It was vivid, chromatic, and visually aggressive by modern museum standards. Temples were painted floor to ceiling in polychrome scenes. Statues were dressed in pigment that reflected the harsh Nile Valley sunlight at close range. The pigment faded, washed away, and was systematically stripped from certain monuments by later cultures who wished to repurpose the stone or remove prior religious imagery. What remained was the underlying architecture, which later Western observers encountered, admired, and mistakenly assumed represented the intended aesthetic of the original builders. Scholars have known this for generations. Computer reconstructions of painted Egyptian temples exist in academic publications and selected museum exhibitions. The image of colorful ancient Egypt has simply never successfully displaced the image of pale stone Egypt in the popular imagination. The Sphinx was painted. It looked nothing like what you picture when you close your eyes, and some of their patients survived. Skeletal remains from ancient Egyptian burial sites have been examined by paleopathologists and found to contain evidence of trepanation, the deliberate drilling or cutting of holes into the human skull, dating back as far as 3000 BCE. Several of the skulls examined show signs of bone regrowth around the surgical opening, which confirms unambiguously that the patient did not die during the procedure, but survived for a period of time afterward measured in weeks or months. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to approximately 1600 BCE, but believed to be a copy of a text from as far back as 2500 BCE, contains 48 case studies of traumatic injuries, including head wounds, described with clinical precision that has impressed modern neurosurgeons who have examined the text. The author of the papyrus distinguishes between cases that can be treated, cases that might be treated with difficulty, and cases considered untreatable, a triage framework that aligns with modern emergency medicine practice. The papyrus uses the word brain and describes the surface of the brain, with a term translated as resembling the rippling of copper slag, an accurate description of the convolutions of the cerebral cortex that would not be formally described in Western medicine until centuries later. The Edwin Smith Papyrus was purchased by the American Egyptologist Edwin Smith in Luxor in 1862. It sat in the New York Historical Society for years before being fully translated and recognized as the most significant medical document of the ancient world. The god Min was one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, worshipped from the pre-dynastic period onward as a god of fertility, sexuality, male potency, and, somewhat incongruously, lettuce. Min was always depicted in the same pose, facing forward, one arm raised, holding a flail, and with a permanent and explicitly depicted erection. This was standard religious iconography displayed in temples, on stelae, and in processional statues carried through public spaces during festivals. The fertility festival of Min, celebrated annually, involved the pharaoh ritually harvesting lettuce in front of the statue of the god and presenting it as an offering. The lettuce connection was not arbitrary. The particular variety of romaine lettuce cultivated in ancient Egypt, Lactuca sativa, produces a white milky sap when its stalk is cut. The Egyptians interpreted this sap as analogous to semen. The lettuce was therefore sacred to Min, not as a vegetable, but as a visible symbol of male reproductive fluid in agricultural form. Eating it was believed to enhance male potency. This was official state religion. The pharaoh participated personally. The ritual was inscribed on temple walls at Karnak and Medinet Habu in scenes that are accessible to any tourist who visits those sites today. The god with the permanent erection whose sacred plant was a lettuce is not in the children's books about ancient Egypt. He was, however, in the temples that the children's books are illustrated with photographs of. And no consensus explanation has been accepted by the mainstream archaeological community. In 1992, German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova published results of chemical analysis conducted on Egyptian mummies from the Munich Museum collection, including the mummy of Henut Tawi, a priestess who died approximately 3,000 years ago. The analysis detected the presence of cocaine and nicotine metabolites in the hair, skin, and bone tissue of multiple mummies tested. Cocaine is derived from coca plants that are native exclusively to South America. Nicotine, while present in some Old World plants in trace quantities, is found in quantities consistent with tobacco use only in tobacco plants that are likewise native to the Americas. The Americas were not, according to the standard historical timeline, known to ancient Egyptians. Balabanova's findings were immediately and intensely contested. Critics proposed contamination, methodological errors, and the possibility of Old World plants with nicotine-like compounds as alternative explanations. Balabanova invited independent laboratories to conduct their own analyses. Several did. Several confirmed her results. The debate has not been resolved to the satisfaction of mainstream Egyptology, which continues to treat the findings as an anomaly rather than as evidence requiring a revision of contact history. What is not disputed is that the chemical analysis was conducted with forensic-level methodology. What is disputed is what the results mean. The mummies are in the museum. The test results are in the published literature. The explanation remains officially open, and they played them in tombs for the dead for eternity. The game of Senet is one of the oldest board games in recorded human history, with examples found in pre-dynastic burials dating to approximately 3100 BCE. It was played on a board of 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10, using throwing sticks as randomizing elements. It began as a recreational game and over centuries acquired profound religious significance until it became, by the New Kingdom period, a game explicitly associated with the journey of the soul through the underworld. The funerary papyri of the period include scenes of the deceased playing senet against an invisible opponent in the afterlife. Boards and game pieces were placed in tombs as essential equipment for the journey ahead. Tutankhamun's tomb contained 4 senet sets of varying degrees of luxury, indicating that even among grave goods of extraordinary richness, the game was considered important enough to include in quadruplicate. What makes senet genuinely strange is that no complete set of rules has been recovered from any ancient text. Scholars have reconstructed probable rules from images and board configurations. But the actual gameplay mechanics that Egyptians used for 3,000 years are unknown. The most popular game in one of history's great civilizations was played for 3 millennia, and the instructions were never written down, or were written down and have not yet been found. Every Egyptian who played senet knew how to play it. Every archaeologist who has ever studied it has had to guess. Not in any ethnic or cultural sense that the word Egyptian carries in popular usage. Cleopatra VII, the figure known to history as the last active pharaoh of ancient Egypt, was Macedonian Greek by ancestry. She was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by Ptolemy I, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, who took control of Egypt following Alexander's conquest in 332 BCE. The Ptolemaic rulers maintained a Macedonian Greek court culture, spoke Greek as their primary language, and for the first 2 centuries of the dynasty made almost no concession to Egyptian language or religious practice. Cleopatra VII was, by several historical accounts, the first member of the Ptolemaic dynasty to learn to speak Egyptian at all, a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years at the time of her birth. She also reportedly spoke 8 or 9 additional languages, which ancient sources cite as one of her most remarkable qualities. The Cleopatra of popular culture, Egyptian queen, daughter of the Nile, embodiment of ancient Egyptian civilization, is a figure largely constructed by Roman propaganda, Renaissance art, and Hollywood. The actual Cleopatra was the Greek-speaking head of a Hellenistic bureaucratic state who happened to govern the territory of Egypt and who strategically performed Egyptian religious roles for domestic political purposes. This has been known to Egyptologists since the discipline existed. It appears in every academic treatment of the Ptolemaic period. It does not appear in the vast majority of the films, novels, and television programs that have been made about her. And they acted on this belief during mummification in a way that still disturbs people who learn about it. In Egyptian funerary practice, the organs were removed from the body and preserved separately in canopic jars, to be reunited with the body in the afterlife. The heart was left in place inside the chest cavity because it was considered the organ of thought, memory, emotion, and personality. The essential self that would be judged in the Hall of Two Truths and weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The brain was removed through the nasal cavity using a long hook, liquefied by rotation, drained out, and discarded. This was not an oversight or a primitive error. It was a theologically coherent decision, based on a specific and consistent anatomical belief system. The heartbeat changed rhythm with emotion, stopped at death. The brain did nothing observable. The conclusion the ancient Egyptians reached from direct observation was that the heart was alive and the brain was filler. The procedure of brain removal, the hook inserted through the nostril, the rotation to break down tissue, the drainage through the same passage, is described in technical detail in funerary texts and has been confirmed by endoscopic examination of intact mummies. Radiological imaging of mummified heads frequently shows the residue of incomplete brain removal still present in the cranial cavity. The brain of Ramesses II, one of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history, was drained through his nose and thrown away. His heart was preserved with considerable care for the journey to eternity. He did not need his brain where he was going, not magical threats, actual juridical warnings with institutional weight. The so-called curses inscribed at the entrances of Egyptian tombs were not the mystical imprecations that the popular imagination, fueled by the coverage of Tutankhamun's tomb opening in 1922, has made them. They were formal legal and religious declarations invoking specific divine authorities to punish anyone who violated the tomb, stolen its contents, or disturbed the rest of the deceased. The texts were written in the first person of the tomb owner. A typical inscription from the Old Kingdom period might state that the tomb owner would act as a crocodile against any person who entered uninvited, or that the violator would be seized by the wrath of specific named deities. These were not empty threats in the Egyptian worldview. They were legally and spiritually binding declarations witnessed by the gods. More practically, the curses served a function similar to a modern property deed, a public declaration of ownership and protected status that any literate visitor would be able to read. The language was calibrated to invoke maximum divine sanction. The Egyptians were not hiding their tombs from literate people. They were warning them. The evidence that Egyptologists and archaeologists who opened Egyptian tombs subsequently died at unusual rates has been examined statistically and does not hold up to scrutiny. The famous death toll following the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb has been repeatedly shown to reflect normal mortality patterns for the ages of the individuals involved, not supernatural intervention. The narrative of the mummy's curse was created almost entirely by newspapers in 1923, looking for a dramatic story. The curses were real. The magic was not. The journalism was. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom maintained royal menageries of imported exotic animals that served simultaneously as symbols of divine power, the instruments of political theater, and personal pets in the most extreme possible sense. Ramesses II, the longest reigning major pharaoh in Egyptian history, was accompanied in battle, according to inscriptions at Abu Simbel, by a tame lion named Tefin, who fought alongside him at the Battle of Kadesh. Whether this is historical fact or royal propaganda is debated. That Ramesses kept lions as personal animals is supported by multiple artistic depictions showing him in proximity to lions in contexts that suggest familiarity rather than ritual. Other documented animals in royal collections included cheetahs used for hunting, bears imported from Syria, giraffes brought from sub-Saharan Africa as tribute from Nubian expeditions, and hippopotami maintained in palace pools.
Push harder on the left.
The logistics of keeping a living giraffe in a Nile Valley palace in the 2nd millennium BCE, transport, feeding, veterinary management without modern knowledge, are staggering to consider. Hatshepsut's expedition to the land of Punt documented in extraordinary relief carvings at Deir el-Bahari, returned to Egypt with living myrrh trees transported in baskets of soil, living animals including baboons, and a range of trade goods. The baboons appear in the relief carvings on the expedition ships, seated among the cargo, apparently calm. The logistical organization required to transport living tropical animals by ship from the Horn of Africa to the Nile Valley and deliver them alive to a royal palace has received considerably less attention than the gold and incense that came with them. It happened in 1159 BCE, and the workers had specific and reasonable demands. Under Ramesses III, the workmen of Deir el-Medina, the specialized village of craftsmen responsible for cutting and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, stopped work and refused to return to their stations. The reason was straightforward. Their monthly rations of grain, the currency in which they were paid, had not been delivered for 18 days. The men were hungry. They walked off the job. The Turin Strike Papyrus, a document discovered in the early 19th century and now held in the Egyptian Museum of Turin, contains the oldest known written account of a labor action in history. The workers marched to the nearby mortuary temples, sat down, and stated their grievance explicitly to the administrators. They used language that has been translated as, "We are hungry. 18 days have already passed this month." The statement was clear, factual, and directed at specific institutional failure. The response of the Egyptian administration was to negotiate. Rations were eventually delivered, though partially and with delay. The workers returned. The cycle repeated in subsequent months as the broader economic difficulties of the late Ramesses, the third period, continued to strain the state's capacity to pay its specialists. The workers of Deir el-Medina were not slaves. They were skilled state employees with housing, medical care, and paid rations who had a functioning collective consciousness of their own rights as workers. When those rights were violated, they stopped working and demanded redress. This happened 3,182 years before the word strike entered English labor vocabulary. And this single fact reorganizes everything. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BCE. Cleopatra VII died in 30 BCE. The moon landing occurred in 1969 CE. The time between Cleopatra and the moon landing is approximately 2,000 years. The time between Cleopatra and the construction of the Great Pyramid is approximately 2,500 years. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the invention of the internet than to the workers who cut the first stones at Giza. When tourists visit the Great Pyramid and then visit the Egyptian Museum to see the artifacts of Cleopatra's era, they are looking at two objects separated by a span of time greater than the entire history of Western civilization from Rome to the present day. From the perspective of the ancient Egyptians of Cleopatra's time, the pyramid builders were as remote as ancient Rome is to us today. This means that ancient Egypt was not one civilization. It was a sequence of civilizations spanning 30 centuries, connected by language, religion, and geography, but separated by internal transformations as dramatic as anything in the history of any culture on Earth. The Egypt that built the pyramids was not the Egypt that built the temples at Luxor, which was not the Egypt that Cleopatra ruled, which was not the same in any living cultural sense as any of the others. The word ancient in ancient Egypt is doing work that no single word in any language is equipped to do. When you hear the phrase, add a 0 to whatever timescale you are imagining, then add another one, Egypt Revealed. Subscribe for more.